Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a world that's often hidden, isn't it? The surprising realities of nuclear weapons.
That's right.
Forget the big mushroom clouds for a second. We're going to explore the unexpected history, the constant upkeep, and the really complex politics behind it all tailored just for you.
Exactly. It's so much more than just the bombs. It's the whole system, the people, the history. We've pulled together some really interesting sources today to try and shed some light.
Okay, let's get into it. For this deep dive, you've got a recent 2024 overview from the Federation of American Scientists that gives us a current snapshot of the U.S. arsenal.
Yeah, the FAS report, it's considered a leading public source on this.
Right, and then we're going deep into a U.S. Army War College report. That one details the history of tactical nuclear weapons, TNWs, within NATO.
That's a crucial piece, yeah. And then for a more sort of hands-on feel, there's Andy McLuhan's YouTube channel exploring British Cold War nuclear artillery.
Nuclear artillery.
Okay.
And we also have a pretty fascinating Reddit discussion, plus info from Wikipedia and a 1999 Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board report, all looking at one specific warhead, the W79.
Exactly. The goal is really to weave all these threads together, give you a clear, concise picture without getting too bogged down in, this super technical jargon.
Got it. We want the surprising facts, the why behind things.
That's the plan.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture then. The current U.S. arsenal, based on that FAS report, you said they're a leading authority. What jumped out at you from their 2024 overview?
Well, one thing that really stood out, it might seem small, but it's this detail about the U.S. Air Force forward deploying about a third of its B-2 stealth bombers.
A third. Where to?
To Diego Garcia.
Diego Garcia. Wow, that remote island base in the Indian Ocean? That feels significant. Why is that deployment so noteworthy?
Well, think about it. That third of the B-2 fleet, it actually represents something like half of the B-2s that are considered fully mission capable at any given time.
Half the operational bombers.
So putting them way out there in Diego Garcia, it suggests a real strategic focus, probably projecting power into the Indo-Pacific region. The report doesn't spell it out, but you can sort of read between the lines.
Interesting. So even now, with long-range tech, putting assets physically forward still matters strategically.
Absolutely. Presence matters.
Okay. Now let's step back in time a bit. Tactical nuclear weapons and NATO. That Army War College report sounds fascinating. How did these things even come about?
Right. So the report makes it clear. Tactical nuclear weapons, or TNWs, they were basically a U.S. invention. Late 1940s, early 1950s.
What spurred that?
A couple of big things, really. The Soviets getting the bomb, that was huge. And the Korean War happening at the same time. It sort of accelerated the whole process.
So a direct reaction to new threats, needing new ways to counter them.
Precisely. TNWs became a really key part of U.S. deterrence strategy, especially thinking about Europe and also Korea.
In the Soviets.
Oh yeah, the Soviets deployed large numbers too, but they're thinking their doctrine around them was a bit different.
And how did NATO's view on TNWs evolve? Did it stay static?
Not at all. NATO's reliance really peaked, probably late 60s, early 70s. Then the numbers started dropping.
Why'd they climb?
Several things came together. People started questioning how useful they'd actually be in a fight. Conventional weapons were getting much better, more precise. And, there was growing anti-nuclear feeling in Europe, too.
But they haven't disappeared entirely.
No, and the report notes that for Russia, they still see them as pretty important today.
The report also mentions this other term, non-strategic nuclear weapons, NSNWs. Is that just another name for TNWs, or is there a difference we should grasp?
Yeah, they're often used interchangeably, but NSNW is maybe a bit more precise. It's defined by what isn't covered in current arms control treaties like START or the old INF treaty.
So it's about treaty definitions.
Mostly, yes. And an interesting point the report makes is that for newer nuclear states, they often see all their weapons as strategic. Because for them, the main goal is simply deterring any attack in the first place.
That makes total sense. It's about perspective, isn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, moving on in the report. Eisenhower's massive retaliation. How did TNWs fit into that whole new look strategy?
Well, Eisenhower was very focused on costs. He saw nuclear weapons, including the smaller tactical ones, as a more, let's say, cost-effective way to deter communism compared to keeping huge conventional armies everywhere.
More bang for the buck, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. His new look policy really leaned on that. He even thought, though historians now think he was probably wrong, that threatening nukes helped break the stalemate in the Korean War talks.
So a strong belief in their power, even the tactical ones, and NATO jumped on board board with this.
Oh, absolutely. 1953, NATO officially adopts the concept.
Huh.
Field Marshal Montgomery famously said their use was very definitely planned if NATO was attacked.
Wow, definitely.
Yeah. The idea was to normalize them, make them seem like just another military tool, blur the lines between strategic and battlefield use to make the deterrent stronger.
And they deployed them.
They did. U.S. nuclear artillery arrived in West Germany in '54. By 1960, NATO had something like 3,000 TNWs scattered across Europe. Forward deployment was seen as critical, sort of a use-it-or-lose-it mindset.
That sounds incredibly risky, though. Were people worried back then?
Oh, definitely. The report points out some really sharp questions being asked even then, like, could you use these things in Europe without obliterating the place you're trying to defend?
A pretty fundamental question.
And could the military's need for, quick release authority ever line up with the politicians wanting to hold back and deliberate?
The political versus military control issue.
Exactly. And maybe the biggest question, what does victory even mean if you start throwing tactical nukes around on European battlefields?
Chilling thoughts. The report mentions a specific Cold War simulation, Exercise Beria. That sounds ominous.
Yeah, Beria gives you a really grim idea. The scenario involved a huge clash, and get this, over 2,200 TNW detonations. About 1,000 Soviet, 1,200 NATO.
2,200 detonations.
The imagined devastation. It just shows the unbelievable risks, even with these supposedly tactical weapons.
That's hard to even wrap your head around. Okay, so later, NATO shifted strategy again to something called flexible response. What was that about?
Flexible response, adopted in '67, it was really a compromise. It moved away from planning to fight with nukes towards using them to end a war.
How so?
The idea was to deter a Soviet attack by being deliberately ambiguous about how NATO might respond, signaling that nuclear escalation was possible without locking themselves into using them right away.
So less about winning a nuclear battle, more about managing escalation and preventing the big one.
That's a good way to put it. Strategic ambiguity to control escalation, not fight a limited nuclear war.
Got it. The report also mentions secrecy. Initially, these deployments were very hush-hush.
Very much so. De Gaulle, the French president, was apparently furious when he found out the U.S. had nukes in France without really telling him. That led to them being removed from France.
Right. But that changed later. More transparency.
Yeah, by 1987, things had shifted. They set up these programs of cooperation so host nations actually got more detailed info about U.S. weapons on their soil.
Driven by politics and needing allied trust, I imagine.
Seems likely, yeah.
So what happened to all these thousands of TNWs after the Cold War ended?
Big changes then. Presidents Bush Sr. and Yeltsin made these large unilateral cuts in '91, '92, the presidential nuclear initiatives.
Unilateral, so not a formal treaty.
No treaties and parallel actions. NATO pulled out most of its TNWs, leaving just, quote, several hundred B-61 bombs in Europe. And the U.S. got rid of its nuclear artillery shells and short-range missiles everywhere, except, at that time, South Korea.
And more recently?
The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review under Obama aimed to further reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. strategy overall.
So a huge reduction, but some are still there in Europe. What's their purpose now, according to the report?
Mostly political signaling is the idea, showing commitment to allies, especially in tense times.
But using them, that seems difficult.
Increasingly so, yeah. Getting all of NATO to agree on actually using one in a crisis. The report suggests that's a really tough ask now. So the B-61s and the planes that can carry them, they signal commitment, but raise questions about how consultation would actually work under pressure.
Okay, and the report also talks about Asia. U.S. nukes assuring allies there.
Yeah, that's another dimension. Using the U.S. nuclear umbrella to reassure countries like South Korea, Taiwan, partly to discourage them from building their own nukes, show them the U.S. commitment was solid.
And the U.S. called the shots there.
Pretty much, especially right after World War II. The power dynamic was very lopsided. The U.S. could set nuclear policy in Asia without much allied input back then.
But that might be changing now.
That's what the report suggests. As U.S. conventional dominance is challenged, especially by China's military growth, the nuclear aspect of those Asian alliances might become more prominent again.
And the situation there is different from Europe.
Very different. In Europe, you had a pretty unified threat perception, the Warsaw Pact. That gave some coherence to views on TNWs. In Asia, the threats and perspectives are much more diverse, less unified.
Right. Let's switch gears to Russia's view on TNWs today. The report covers this too. How do they see these weapons?
Russia tends to see its advantage, or perceived advantage, in tactical nukes as a way to balance NATO's strength in conventional forces.
A counterweight.
Exactly. Especially with things like NATO missile defense systems, which they deeply distrust, and the precision of U.S. conventional strike capabilities.
That suspicion about missile defense, the MD. Why is that such a sticking point? The report emphasizes it.
They see NATO putting BMD systems near their borders as a direct potential threat to their own strategic missiles, their main deterrent. It fundamentally affects their strategic calculations.
And that blocks progress on TNW talks.
It's been a major obstacle, yeah. This suspicion makes negotiating reductions in tactical weapons very, very difficult.
The report mentions globalization, too. How does that fit into Russia's thinking?
Well, where some Western thinkers see globalization as markets integrating under sort of U.S. influence, Russia sees more of a shift towards a multipolar world, different power centers.
And that affects their view on arms control.
It pushes them towards wanting multilateral deals on non-strategic nukes, not just U.S.-Russia agreements. They see the world changing.
What about Russia's geography and demographics? The report brings those up.
Having borders with 14 different countries, plus a declining population, these things contribute to a sense of strategic vulnerability. It probably reinforces their preference for security arrangements involving multiple countries.
And the 2008 Georgia War, how is that relevant?
The report suggests that the military weaknesses shown in that conflict likely reinforce their view that TNWs might be needed to compensate against enemies with better conventional tech.
So despite Western pressure, Russia's unlikely to budge on its TNWs.
That seems to be the assessment, yes. They see them as valuable bargaining chips and are really suspicious of Western motives when it comes to reducing or disclosing them.
And their main goal?
Strategic stability. And they see their big strategic nuclear weapons as the absolute foundation of that stability. So they're very cautious about any arms cuts they think might weaken that foundation.
Russia also has a specific view on NATO's evolution since the Cold War, doesn't it?
Yes, they tend to see NATO shifting from just defense towards intervention, like in Kosovo. They viewed that as a potential risk. Now, with their own military modernization, they see interventions against Russia itself as, quote, unthinkable.
And their big military exercises.
Things like Vostok 2010, they test their modernized conventional forces, but also highlight their geostrategic position, especially in the Far East.
So summing up Russia's TNW doctrine, what's the core idea?
It's set within a broad Eurasian context, looking at lots of different potential threats. They seem to view low-yield TNWs as potentially useful for disrupting advanced conventional attacks, or maybe de-escalating a local war.
So a shift from the Cold War focus on massive invasion.
Yeah, seems the bigger worry now is technologically superior conventional forces, not necessarily huge tank armies rolling across borders.
Okay, that gives us a really good handle on the U.S. arsenal, the history, the NATO-Russia dynamic. Let's shift now to the UK and nuclear artillery. Based on that Andy McLuhan YouTube video, what was the context there?
Very much driven by the Cold War fear of a Soviet invasion of West Germany. That 7 days to the River Rhine scenario. NATO had divided Germany into national defense sectors, and the British Army was right there facing a major Soviet force.
And Britain's own nuclear program, that started because of U.S. restrictions, right?
Exactly. The U.S. McMahon Act of '46 basically locked down U.S. atomic tech. So the U.K. felt it had to develop its own capability. That led to their high-energy research program under William Penny.
An independent drive. But the U.S. did eventually supply them.
Yes, later on. To the Royal Navy, the RAF, that was Project E, and importantly for this discussion, to the British Army.
And the first system for the Army was?
The Corporal Ballistic Missile. Deployed in West Germany from about 58 to 65, it was, well, pretty primitive, actually.
Primitive. That old training film in the video looked quite complex. All those vans and procedures.
It looked the part, sure, but the reality was the Corporal was very complex to operate and notoriously unreliable. Lots of technical problems. That film shows the setup, the radar, the computer van, the countdown, but doesn't really capture the headaches of keeping it working day to day.
Right. They got a better system later, the Lance missile.
Yes, Lance was a big improvement. You could fly it in on a cargo plane, deploy it faster with a smaller crew, maybe 15 minutes. The procedures were more like regular artillery, and it could also fire conventional cluster bombs, not just nukes.
The video also mentions the atomic cannon. That thing is legendary.
It is. The U.S. deployed the W-33 nuclear artillery shell, nicknamed Whiskey, for its huge 280mm cannon in West Germany under an agreement with the UK, too.
Did they ever fire it in Europe?
Never in anger, no. Just simulations. And crucially, As a safety measure, the part needed to actually fire the nuclear component was stored separately, an early kind of permissive action link, or PL.
Safety first. Okay, that brings us to the W79 shell. That's the one we're looking at more closely. It replaced the W33.
That's right. The W79 came along in 1975. An 8-inch shell used a plutonium linear implosion design,
Meaning?
a specific, fairly advanced way to trigger the nuclear chain reaction. Key thing was, the W79 was a sealed unit. No complex assembly in the field, less maintenance needed, and a much smaller yield, only about 1 kiloton, more tactical.
And these were deployed in West Germany.
Yes, with both U.S. and British artillery units.
But the video says they were withdrawn pretty suddenly. Why?
Politics, mostly. In the late 80s, as German reunification looked possible, media coverage stirred up opposition in West Germany. Why have these things here anymore?
Political pressure.
Huge pressure. By spring 1990, all the W79s in Germany were disarmed, made non-deployable. There was a technical issue they found an engineering fix for, but then President Bush Sr. decided unilaterally to remove all NATO battlefield nukes anyway, so it became irrelevant.
So political shifts in Germany directly led to its removal. It's amazing how interconnected it all is.
It really is.
The video ends on a concerning note about Russia's current stance on these weapons.
Yeah, it's quite stark. Officially, Russia says its old Soviet nuclear shells aren't usable. But then you have senior Russian officers openly talking about planning nuclear artillery missions during a big exercise, Zapad 2021.
And Putin's recent rhetoric.
In 2024, he essentially made veiled threats about potentially using such weapons. It makes some analysts look back at NATO getting rid of all its battlefield nukes and wonder if that was maybe a misjudgment, given where we are now.
A sobering thought indeed, that weapons seemingly from the past can still cast such a long shadow.
Okay, let's really zoom in on the W79 now. We have that Reddit discussion, Wikipedia info, and the safety board report. Starting with Reddit, it offers a surprisingly personal angle.
It really does.
Yeah.
This user, the vet author, clearly had hands-on experience, talks about finding the LLC's probably line-limited components, specific internal parts once he took the nose off.
And he worked on them.
Yeah, he describes spending 2 months just removing these components because of some defect. Had to be done in a special sealed room, 3 people in full protective gear.
Yeah.
Said they processed hundreds that way. Hundreds. Wow. That really brings home the sheer scale and the meticulous, maybe even hazardous work involved in just maintaining or dismantling these things.
Absolutely. Just imagining one person spending 2 months on that task. It's quite something.
Another Reddit user, High Order 1, mentioned the design.
Yeah, commented on how packed it was inside, like an engine bay, very little FD space compared to some other nuclear devices, made working on it, taking it apart, presumably quite tricky.
Okay, turning to the Wikipedia entry on the W79, what technical details does that add?
It confirms the 1 kiloton yield, gives ranges. 24 kilometers normally, up to 30 kilometers with rocket assist. Details the M735 proximity fuse, pretty sophisticated for the time, with target sensors, programmer power supply.
And the design goals.
Main aims were minimizing weight and size and trying to get rid of messy potting materials and complex wiring harnesses inside, though they didn't quite manage to eliminate all the potting material.
And Wikipedia also mentions safety concerns that actually led to more nuclear tests. That's significant.
It is. Back in early '88, computer simulations suggested that W79 might not meet the crucial 1-point safety standard in certain accident scenarios.
1-point safety meaning?
Meaning it absolutely shouldn't go off if the high explosive is accidentally detonated at just a single point. It's a fundamental safety rule.
And tests.
Unfortunately, underground tests later in '88 and early '89 confirmed the simulations. Under those specific unlikely conditions, there was a safety issue. It just underscores the constant need for testing and vigilance.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, that 1999 Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board report. It's broader than just the W79, but what does it tell us about safety and maintenance across the board, especially with weapon disassembly?
Right. The Safety Board is the independent watchdog overseeing DOE's nuclear weapons activities, including taking weapons apart and looking after the remaining stockpile. This 99 report shows DOE was actively dismantling weapons then and praised them for improving safety management overall.
So a constant process of disassembly and safety upgrades.
Exactly. The board focuses on stockpile stewardship, keeping the remaining weapons safe and reliable, dealing with the materials from dismantled weapons, and the safety of the facilities themselves.
Does the report highlight any specific examples or issues related to disassembly or safety protocols?
Yeah, several things. It mentions improvements needed in sampling the high explosives in weapons waiting for dismantlement at the Pantex plant. the main assembly-disassembly site.
Okay.
A specific board recommendation, 96-1, actually stopped DOE from restarting a facility at the Savannah River site due to safety worries, pushing them to find alternative methods.
So real impact from the board's oversight.
Definitely. It also points to the W79 Warhead dismantlement as a success story done efficiently and with better safety features. A positive example.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. It sounds like safety is a constant challenge.
Absolutely. The report flags potential vulnerabilities at the Y-12 facility involving chemicals and possible uranium spills. It notes ongoing readiness issues for hazardous work at Hanford's plutonium concentration facility.
And long-term storage.
Concerns were raised about storing uranium-233 long-term at Oak Ridge in Idaho due to its high radioactivity and infrequent inspections at the time. It also details the huge job of deactivating the old B plant at Hanford from the WWII era, removing contamination, upgrading systems, all under board oversight.
It's reassuring in a way to know this level of scrutiny exists. The report also mentions counterfeit parts. That sounds like a major concern.
A critical one, yeah. The board noted DOE had measures in place to prevent suspect or counterfeit parts getting into the stockpile, which is obviously vital for safety and reliability.
And the board itself.
They highlighted their own no-frills approach and using tech like the internet even back in '99 for efficiency. And Recommendation 98-1 pushed DOE to keep improving its overall safety management system, noting implementation wasn't always consistent across different sites.
Okay. So bringing this all together, the current arsenal snapshot, the deep history of tactical nukes, the British experience, the W79 details, and this crucial safety oversight. What are the main takeaways for our listeners from this deep dive?
Well, I think first, the whole world of nuclear weapons, especially tactical ones, involves way more technical detail and rigorous safety protocols than maybe we realize. It's not just the big strategic picture.
Right, the nitty-gritty matters.
And it's all wrapped up in this incredibly complex, constantly shifting mix of military strategy and international politics. Even small things like deploying those B-2s show ongoing strategic calculations.
And the W79 story.
That really illustrates how dynamic things are. A weapon is designed, deployed, faces technical issues, but ultimately gets withdrawn, mainly due to political changes on the ground. It shows how sensitive these deployments can be.
And the safety aspect.
The constant intensive oversight by bodies like the Safety Board just underscores how critical safety and security are. It's a never-ending job in this field.
That's a great synthesis, pulling all those threads together. Okay, time for our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed about the history of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, and looking at the current geopolitical situation, what are the potential implications of Russia seemingly putting renewed focus on these kinds of weapons? And maybe more importantly, how might NATO's response shape security dynamics going forward?
That's definitely something worth thinking about.
Indeed, a really important question to keep in mind as you follow world events. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.